The wind howled through the dense trees as Emma and her friends approached the abandoned cabin deep in the woods. The place was worn and weathered, with paint peeling off the wooden planks and windows clouded by dust and grime. Inside, the air was thick and musty, with the faint scent of damp wood lingering in every corner. As the sun set on July 30th, they unpacked their bags, setting up their sleeping spaces in what used to be a cozy living room. That night, as Emma lay awake on her sleeping bag, a cold draft crept through the cracks in the walls. She shivered and pulled her blanket tighter, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't leave. The creaking of the floorboards echoed through the silent cabin, though everyone else was already fast asleep. She listened closely and thought she heard soft whispers, like someone was murmuring just beyond the walls. Her pulse quickened as she held her breath, straining to hear more, but the whispers faded into the night. By the next morning, the whispers were gone, and Emma tried to brush off the experience as just her imagination running wild. The group decided to explore the cabin, which looked larger from the inside than it had appeared from the outside. As they ventured into the basement, they came across a heavy metal door, sealed tightly at the far end of the room. No one could recall seeing a key for it, and it didn't budge, no matter how hard they tried. The strange door sat there, silent and foreboding, its presence unsettling Emma more than she cared to admit. That night, as a storm raged outside, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She dreamt of the metal door, this time slightly ajar, with dark tendrils of smoke seeping out from the edges. In the dream, she stood frozen in front of it, unable to move as the whispers grew louder, beckoning her closer. When she woke up, drenched in sweat, she swore she heard the door creaking open in the basement. Her heart raced, and she clutched her blanket, hoping it was just the wind. The storm outside had subsided by morning, leaving a thick mist hanging low in the forest. Emma couldn't stop thinking about the dream and the sound of the door creaking open. As she went about her day, her thoughts kept drifting back to the basement. The idea that something might be lurking behind that door gnawed at her. Her friends were oblivious to her growing unease, laughing and joking as they planned another day of hiking through the woods. That night, the cabin felt heavier, as though the very air inside had thickened with an invisible tension. Emma lay in her sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling, listening intently for any sign of movement. The faint whispers returned, just like the previous night. Only this time, they were clearer, more distinct. They called her name softly, urging her to come closer. Her heart pounded in her chest as she sat up, straining to hear where the whispers were coming from. She couldn't resist the pull. Emma grabbed a flashlight and quietly made her way down the creaky wooden stairs into the basement. The air grew colder with each step, and the light from her flashlight flickered uncertainly. When she reached the bottom, she saw it. The metal door was ajar, just like in her dream. Her breath caught in her throat as she approached cautiously, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. She peered through the small opening, but all she saw was darkness. Her friends found her standing in front of the door the next morning, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. They tried to laugh it off, blaming her night walk on too much camping excitement. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her from behind that door. The more they joked, the more determined she became to uncover what was hidden in the cabin's dark past. She began to search through the cabin's dusty shelves and drawers, hoping to find answers. After hours of searching, she finally stumbled upon an old journal, tucked away in a small box in the attic. The pages were yellowed and fragile, but the writing was still legible. As Emma flipped through the pages, she realized it belonged to someone who had lived in the cabin decades ago. The entries detailed a series of strange events, each more unsettling than the last. The final pages mentioned a ritual, one that had been performed to seal away a dark presence behind that very door. The journal's final pages weighed heavily on Emma's mind as she sat alone in the attic. The details of the ritual were vague, but one thing was clear. It was meant to trap something malevolent. She felt a chill run down her spine as she glanced toward the door leading to the basement. The whispers had stopped for now, but the silence felt even more unnerving. Emma knew she had to confront whatever was behind that door, but the thought of doing so filled her with dread. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emma gathered her courage and approached her friends. She shared what she had discovered, but they remained skeptical. They didn't believe in ghosts or ancient rituals, dismissing her concerns as nothing more than superstition. Frustrated, but undeterred, Emma knew she couldn't rely on them. The whispers returned that night, louder and more urgent, as though whatever was behind the door was growing restless. She could feel it watching her, waiting for her to make a move. Determined to put an end to the strange occurrences, Emma decided to perform the ritual herself. She spent hours preparing, following the instructions in the journal as best as she could. The basement grew colder as she worked, the air thick with an unsettling presence. As she chanted the final words of the ritual, the door trembled violently, and a gust of icy wind burst from within. Emma staggered back, her heart racing. But then, just as suddenly as it began, everything went still. For a moment, there was silence. Then the oppressive feeling that had weighed on the cabin for days lifted. The whispers stopped, and the air became warm and calm. Emma let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. The ritual had worked. Whatever had been trapped behind that door was now sealed away for good. As she stood there, surrounded by the now peaceful cabin, she felt an overwhelming sense of relief. It was over. Finally, they could leave this place behind. The following morning, the cabin seemed different. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the once gloomy space. The air felt lighter, no longer weighed down by the oppressive presence that had haunted Emma and her friends. Emma woke up feeling refreshed, her nightmares gone, and the whispers now a distant memory. As they packed their belongings, she couldn't help but glance toward the basement door one last time. It was firmly shut, and for the first time since they had arrived, Emma felt a sense of closure. As they left the cabin, Emma's friends were in high spirits, joking and laughing about the strange events of the past few days. They teased her about her ghost hunting adventure, but Emma only smiled. She knew deep down that what had happened was real. Whatever had been trapped behind that door was gone now, and the cabin was just an ordinary place once again. The fear that had gripped her heart had faded, replaced by a quiet confidence that she had faced something dark and emerged unscathed. Driving away from the cabin, Emma felt a deep sense of relief wash over her. The road stretched out before them, leading back to the safety of the world they knew. As the trees thinned and the cabin disappeared from view, she realized how lucky they had been. She couldn't help but wonder what might have happened if she hadn't found the journal or if she hadn't performed the ritual. But those thoughts quickly faded as they left the forest behind. They were safe now. By the time they reached the edge of the forest, the memory of the cabin felt distant, almost like a strange dream. Emma gazed out the window, watching the trees blur past, and allowed herself to relax. Whatever secrets the cabin had held, they were no longer her concern. As they returned to the familiarity of everyday life, Emma carried with her a quiet strength. She had faced the unknown and survived, and that knowledge filled her with a new sense of purpose. The cabin was behind them, and the future lay ahead. The cabin sat nestled in the mountains, isolated and surrounded by dense woods. Jacob and Lily had been looking forward to this trip for weeks, a getaway from the chaos of life. But the moment they arrived, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air was thick with mist, clinging to the trees like a veil, and the cabin itself seemed oddly cold for a summer day in August. The wooden structure was old and worn, its windows fogged over, blocking any view of the outside world. That night, as they settled in, Jacob noticed strange carvings etched into the wooden walls of the cabin. They looked like symbols, crudely drawn and half erased by time. He asked Lily about them, but she brushed it off, more focused on setting up their small campsite outside the cabin. As darkness fell, the mist thickened, rolling over the ground like smoke. Jacob sat by the fire, trying to enjoy the peace and quiet, but his mind kept returning to those strange symbols. They felt like a warning. The night grew colder, and the fog swallowed the world around them. It was quiet. Too quiet. Jacob couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He heard it then, the sound of footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate steps that creaked against the old wood. He stood up quickly, heart pounding. But when he opened the door, there was nothing there. Just the thick mist swirling in the air. He scanned the trees, but saw nothing, only shadows shifting in the fog. Unease settled in the pit of his stomach as he closed the door and bolted it shut. When Jacob returned to Lily, she was already asleep, oblivious to the strange occurrences. But Jacob couldn't rest. He lay awake for hours, his mind racing with possibilities. Who or what had been outside the cabin? The night felt endless, the fog pressing against the windows like a living thing. Just before dawn, Jacob finally drifted off to sleep. But even then, the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of his consciousness. Whatever had been outside wasn't gone. It was waiting. The following day, the mist had barely lifted, leaving a damp, eerie chill in the air. Jacob couldn't shake the memory of the footsteps from the night before, but when he mentioned it to Lily, she shrugged it off as an animal passing by. Still, the feeling of being watched clung to him like the fog. As they hiked through the woods, Jacob felt as though something unseen was trailing them, always just out of sight, hiding in the thick underbrush. Every snap of a twig made him jump, his nerves on edge. Later that afternoon, as they returned to the cabin, the atmosphere inside felt different, heavier. Objects seemed to be out of place. Small things at first. A cup moved from the table to the counter, a chair slightly askew. But it wasn't just the objects. The air itself felt charged with something Jacob couldn't name. Lily noticed it too. Her cheerful demeanor began to change. She became distant, her once lively conversation reduced to brief, cold remarks. Jacob tried to reach out to her, but she seemed detached, her mind elsewhere. That night, Jacob discovered an old mirror tucked away in the corner of the cabin, covered in dust and grime. Its glass was cracked in several places, yet something about it drew him in. As he wiped away the dust, he caught a glimpse of something, just a fleeting shadow passing behind him in the reflection. He spun around, but the room was empty. His pulse quickened as he turned back to the mirror, staring into it, waiting for something to happen. For a moment, he thought he saw something move again, but when he blinked, it was gone. Lily had fallen into an uneasy sleep, mumbling strange, incoherent words as she tossed and turned. Her voice was soft, but it carried an unsettling tone, like she was speaking to someone who wasn't there. Jacob watched her for a moment, his chest tightening with a mix of fear and helplessness. The cabin no longer felt like a safe retreat. It felt like a trap. Something was inside with them, something they couldn't see but could feel. And it was growing stronger. Jacob couldn't shake the growing sense of dread. The cabin felt like a living entity, its walls breathing with some malevolent force. Every corner seemed darker, every creak more sinister. He couldn't take his eyes off the mirror. It seemed to pull him in, as if it held the answers to all the strange occurrences. That night, while Lily slept fitfully, Jacob stood in front of the mirror, staring into its fractured surface. The longer he gazed into it, the more he began to see fleeting figures, like shadows creeping just beyond the glass. Determined to put an end to whatever was happening, Jacob decided to break the mirror. He grabbed a heavy book from the dusty shelf and slammed it against the glass. It shattered instantly, fragments scattering across the floor. For a moment, the air in the cabin seemed to grow still, as if whatever presence had been lurking had finally been released. But the silence didn't bring relief. Instead, it only deepened Jacob's unease. Something had changed, but he wasn't sure if it was for the better. The following day, things only got worse. Lily's behavior became more erratic. She wandered aimlessly through the cabin, her eyes distant, her words disconnected. She didn't seem to recognize Jacob at times, her gaze passing right through him as if he wasn't there. The atmosphere in the cabin grew oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Outside, the mist thickened again, enveloping the cabin in a suffocating embrace. Jacob felt trapped, unsure of what to do next. That night, as Jacob lay in bed, he heard it again. The footsteps on the porch, slow and deliberate. But this time, they didn't stop at the door. He heard them moving inside the cabin, coming closer and closer to the bedroom. His heart raced as he clutched the blanket, too terrified to move. The door creaked open slowly, but when Jacob finally forced himself to look, there was nothing there. Just the thick mist curling into the room, like fingers reaching out to him. Jacob lay frozen in bed, his breath shallow as the mist seeped further into the room. His mind raced with fear and confusion. The cabin felt more alive now than ever, but it wasn't a comforting presence. It was something dark and ancient, something that had been watching them all along. Lily stood at the doorway, her eyes glazed over, her movements slow and deliberate. She wasn't herself anymore. The person Jacob loved seemed to have slipped away, replaced by a cold, distant figure. In a desperate attempt to escape, Jacob grabbed Lily's arm, pleading with her to leave the cabin with him. She didn't respond, her expression blank as if she hadn't heard him. Outside, the mist was thicker than ever, swirling around the cabin like a barrier they couldn't break through. Jacob felt a deep sense of hopelessness, realizing that whatever had been haunting them wasn't going to let them go so easily. He could feel the presence drawing closer, its invisible grip tightening around them both. As the night dragged on, Jacob began to hear voices, faint whispers echoing through the cabin, urging him to leave Lily behind and save himself. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and Jacob felt a strange compulsion to follow them. He stepped out onto the porch, the mist parting for him as he ventured further into the woods. But something held him back, a final, fleeting connection to Lily. He turned around, only to see her standing at the cabin door, watching him with empty, emotionless eyes. Jacob stood there, torn between the need to escape and the desire to save Lily from whatever had taken hold of her. But as he took one step toward the cabin, the mist swallowed her whole, leaving nothing but an eerie silence. The story ends with Jacob standing alone in the woods, staring at the empty space where the cabin once stood, unsure if it had ever been real or just a figment of his darkest fears. Mark and his son, Ben, arrived at the campsite on a crisp September afternoon. They had planned this trip as a way to bond before Ben left for college, choosing a remote spot in the woods far from any distractions. As they set up their tent near an old, abandoned cabin, Mark couldn't help but notice how quiet the forest was. The cabin loomed nearby, its wooden walls weathered and darkened with age, its windows cracked and clouded. Ben insisted on exploring it, but Mark hesitated, feeling a strange unease in the air. That evening, as they sat by the campfire, the silence grew heavier. The woods felt empty. Mark tried to ignore it, but his eyes kept drifting toward the cabin. It stood there, dark and lifeless, yet something about it felt wrong. After a while, Ben decided to call it a night, retreating into the tent. Mark stayed by the fire a little longer, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that something was watching them from within the cabin's shadowed windows. Later that night, Mark was jolted awake by a voice calling his name. He sat up, his heart pounding, and realized it was Ben's voice. It was coming from inside the cabin. Confused and frightened, Mark looked beside him and saw Ben still asleep in the tent. His mind raced as he strained to listen, but the voice had stopped. Shaken, he lay back down, telling himself it must have been a dream. Yet the chill in the air told him otherwise. Something wasn't right. The next morning, Mark tried to shake off the experience, but Ben noticed his father's tension. He laughed it off, teasing Mark for letting an old cabin spook him. But Mark couldn't forget the voice. As they ate breakfast, his eyes kept drifting back to the cabin. It seemed to be waiting for something. Ben, eager to explore, suggested they check out the inside. Mark reluctantly agreed, his instincts screaming at him to stay away, yet unable to explain why. Mark and Ben entered the old cabin cautiously, the floorboards creaking beneath their feet. Dust floated in the air, illuminated by the weak sunlight filtering through the cracked windows. The inside was eerily preserved, as though whoever had lived there had left in a hurry. A thick layer of dust coated the furniture, and faded photographs lined the walls. Mark felt a shiver run down his spine as he examined the photos. There was something familiar about them. Ben was excited, exploring every corner, while Mark remained uneasy. In the back room, they found an old family portrait, the faces barely recognizable beneath the dust. But one face stood out to Mark, a young boy in the photo who looked strikingly similar to Ben. The resemblance was unsettling, and Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they were connected to this place in some strange way. Ben, however, brushed it off, finding the whole thing amusing. That night, as Mark drifted off to sleep, he awoke again to the sound of Ben's voice calling him from inside the cabin. This time, the voice was more insistent, urgent. He quickly checked the tent, but Ben was still there, sound asleep. Fear gripped Mark as he realized the voice was growing louder, pulling him toward the cabin. He felt a strange compulsion to follow it, but something held him back. A deep sense of dread that whatever was inside the cabin wasn't truly his son. The next morning, Ben seemed distant, more quiet than usual. Mark noticed that his son had started sleepwalking again, something he hadn't done since childhood. Ben couldn't remember getting up in the night, but Mark had seen him standing near the cabin, staring into the darkened windows. Mark knew something was wrong, but he couldn't explain it. The cabin's hold on them was growing stronger, and Mark feared that they might not be able to escape its pull. Mark's worry deepened as the days passed. Ben's sleepwalking grew worse, and each night, he wandered closer to the cabin. Mark stayed awake to watch over him, but each time he tried to wake Ben, his son would simply stare blankly at the cabin before returning to bed. The more it happened, the more Mark felt like he was losing his son to whatever force lingered within those walls. He tried to convince Ben to leave, but Ben seemed strangely drawn to the cabin, refusing to go. One afternoon, while exploring the cabin on his own, Mark found an old journal hidden beneath a loose floorboard. The pages were worn and brittle, but the writing was still legible. The journal belonged to the father of the family in the photographs. As Mark read through the entries, he realized that the family had experienced the same strange phenomena that he and Ben were now facing. The journal ended abruptly, with the father's last entry mentioning his son disappearing into the woods one night, never to return. That night, Mark couldn't sleep. He sat by the fire, clutching the journal, his mind racing with fear. Ben had become more distant, his eyes often vacant, and he barely spoke anymore. Mark knew they had to leave, but every time he suggested it, Ben became defensive, insisting they stay just a little longer. Mark felt trapped, torn between protecting his son and the growing realization that the cabin's dark history was repeating itself, threatening to consume them both. As Mark sat in the dark, the voice returned. This time, it wasn't just Ben's voice. It was layered, as if multiple voices were calling out to him from within the cabin. They beckoned him, their tone both soothing and sinister. Mark fought the urge to respond, gripping the journal tightly. He knew the cabin wanted something, but he wasn't sure if he had the strength to resist it. The night seemed to stretch on endlessly, the shadows closing in around him. On the final night, Mark woke with a start to find Ben missing from the tent. Panic surged through him as he bolted out into the cold night, the cabin looming ominously in the darkness. The door stood wide open, and Mark's heart pounded as he raced toward it. Inside, the air was thick with the same oppressive energy he had felt from the beginning. Mark called for Ben, but only the echo of his own voice answered him. The shadows seemed to shift, as though something was moving just out of sight. He found Ben in the back room of the cabin, sitting on the floor, surrounded by the old family photographs. His eyes were vacant, his expression empty as he stared at the faded images. Mark knelt beside him, shaking him gently, trying to snap him out of the trance, but Ben remained unresponsive. It was as if the cabin had stolen the part of him that made him his son. Mark's fear turned to desperation as he realized he might never get Ben back. The voices returned, louder now, filling the room with a chorus of whispers that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. They urged Mark to leave, to abandon Ben and save himself. But Mark couldn't. He clung to his son, tears streaming down his face as the weight of the situation crushed him. He whispered to Ben, pleading with him to wake up, but there was no response. The air grew colder, and Mark felt the presence of something ancient and malevolent closing in. As dawn began to break, Mark realized that he had lost. Ben was gone, not in body, but in spirit. The cabin had taken him, just as it had taken the boy from the old family long ago. Mark staggered outside, the early morning light weakly filtering through the mist. He collapsed on the ground, staring blankly at the trees, knowing he could never leave without his son, but also knowing that he could never truly save him. The cabin had won,